This video will be part 1 of my coverage of Chapter 11 on Carl Rogers' Person-Centered Perspective for PSY 230 Personality Theory. Carl Rogers was born in the early 1900s in Illinois, so he is an American psychologist. He came from a strict religious background, and originally in his pursuits at the University of Wisconsin, he was interested in the ministry. Now, thinking about that, it makes sense where he ended up, which was being a pioneer in counseling psychology, because a good portion of what people are learning when they study to be in the ministry is how to work with people through their difficult challenges in their lives. Although, strictly within a religious context. But there is a significant amount of counselor training that goes on in studying for the ministry. He started out his studies as a graduate student at Union Theological, but he eventually transitioned to studying psychology at Columbia. His first work as a counseling psychologist was in what were at the time called child guidance centers, where he was working with kids and families who were struggling with a variety of issues. So they could be academic issues, they could be growth and development issues, academic challenges, behavior issues, and so on. After this experience of working at a child guidance center, he then put his experiences, his knowledge, and his work with students into the book, The Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, which was language consistent with the time. So look at the year there, 1939. Kids with behavior disorders, kids with learning disabilities, kids with even what would now be called neurobehavioral differences, or, for example, someone on the autism spectrum, would all be in that umbrella of what would now be inappropriate language called the problem child. In his work at Ohio State, he wrote Counseling and Psychotherapy in 1942, which for many, is a book which really established a change, a fundamental shift in the way in which counseling and psychotherapy were done. So really marking a departure, a very firm departure away from the strategy which was so couched in the psychoanalytic tradition of the therapist or analyst who decodes your deepest secrets, and instead working into a more of a partnership model which places the person at the center of the psychotherapy experience. He then moved on to establish a counseling center at the University of Chicago. He stayed there until 1957. During that period of time, he published what is often seen as a critical piece of writing in the field of counseling psychology, client-centered therapy, and that was published in 1951. His primary theoretical work on becoming a person, which is it's really the treatise that covers his entire theory, came out in 1961 and remains in print. He spent a little bit of time at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He wasn't happy there, primarily because the Wisconsin-Madison department was heavily behaviorally based, and he just didn't fit in particularly well there. He then moved on, and this was basically his last stop professionally, to Western Behavioral Science Institute in 1963, and created a research center for studying people from the point of view of his theoretical model. He died in 1987 after a long and rich productive portion of his career while he was still working at the Center for Studies of the Person. So what is this person-centered approach? And I include this quote here because I think it marks the difference, the really clear difference between the humanistic model of Carl Rogers and both the deterministic approaches of behaviorism and psychoanalysis. So in this quote, he talks about not really having much patience for this idea that human beings are basically irrational and bound to their impulses. And in that first part of the quote, he's really saying he disagrees fundamentally with the psychoanalytic position that people are essentially enslaved to their impulses, and if those impulses aren't suppressed or otherwise controlled, then human beings are essentially destructive. And that really was the crux of the psychoanalytic model, that human beings have to find a way to shove their impulses into a more socially appropriate mold, or they will become disruptive. He instead argued that human beings are particularly rational, and they are capable of great growth and self-determination. And though that second part of the quote really, not in so obvious a way as the first half disputes the psychoanalytic model, but the second half really goes against the behavioral model, which states that, human beings are really just the sum total of their learning experiences. He argued that human beings are fundamentally designed to grow toward greater and greater complexity, and that was certainly not the position taken by B.F. Skinner.
From my own years of therapeutic experience, I've come to feel that if I can create the proper climate, the proper relationship, the proper conditions, a process of therapeutic movement will almost inevitably occur in my client. And I'd ask, what is this climate? What are these conditions? Will they exist in the interview with the woman I'm about to talk with whom I've never seen before? Well, let me try to describe very briefly what these conditions are as I see them. First of all, one question is, can I be real in the relationship? This has come to have an increasing amount of importance to me over the years. I feel that genuineness is another way of describing the quality I would like to have. I like the term congruence, by which I mean that what I'm experiencing inside is present in my awareness and comes out through my communication. In a sense, when I have this quality, I'm all in one piece in the relationship. There's another word that describes it for me. I feel that in the relationship, I would like to have a transparency. I would be quite willing for my client to see all the way through me, that there would be nothing hidden. And when I'm real in this fashion that I'm trying to describe, then I know that my own feelings will often bubble up into awareness and be expressed, but be expressed in ways that won't impose themselves on my client. Then the second question I would have is, will I find myself praising this person, caring for this person? I certainly don't want to pretend a caring that I don't feel. In fact, if I dislike my client persistently, I feel it's better that I should express it. But I know that the process of therapy is much more likely to occur, and constructive change is much more likely, if I feel a real spontaneous prizing of this individual with whom I'm working, a prizing of this person as a separate individual. You can call that quality acceptance, you can call it caring, you can call it a non-possessive love, if you wish. I think any of those terms tend to describe it. I know that the relationship will prove more constructive if it's present. Then the third quality, will I be able to understand the inner world of this individual from the inside? Will I be able to see it through her eyes? Will I be able to be sufficiently sensitive to move around inside the world of her feelings so that I know what it feels like to be her, so that I can sense not only the surface meanings, but some of the meanings that lie somewhat underneath the surface. I know that if I can let myself sensitively and accurately enter into her world of experience, then change and therapeutic movement are much more likely. Well, suppose I am fortunate and that I do experience some of these attitudes in the relationship, what then? Well, then a variety of things are likely to happen, both from my clinical experience and from our research investigations. We find that if attitudes of the sort that I've described are present, then quite a number of things will happen. She'll explore some of her feelings and attitudes more deeply. She's likely to discover some hidden aspects of herself that she wasn't aware of previously. Feeling herself prized by me, it's quite possible she'll come to prize herself more. Feeling that some of her meanings are understood by me, then she can more readily perhaps listen to herself, listen to what's going on within her own experience, listen to some of the meanings she hasn't been able to catch before. And perhaps if she senses a realness in me, she'll be able to be a little more real within herself. I suspect there will be a change in the manner of her expression. At least this has been my experience in other instances. From being rather remote from her experiencing, remote from what's going on within her, it's possible that she'll move toward more immediacy of experiencing, that she will be able to sense and express what's going on in her in the immediate moment. From being disapproving of herself, it's quite possible she will move toward a greater degree of acceptance of herself. From somewhat of a fear of relating, she may move toward being able to relate more directly and to encounter me more directly. From construing life in somewhat rigid black and white patterns, she may move toward more tentative ways of construing her experience and of seeing the meanings in it. From a locus of evaluation which is outside of herself, it's quite possible she will move toward recognizing a greater capacity within herself for making judgments and drawing conclusions. So those are some of the changes that we have tended to find, and I think that they are all of them changes that are characteristic of the process of therapy or of therapeutic movement. If I have any success in creating the kind of conditions that I described initially, then we may be able to see some of these changes in this client, even though I know in advance that our contact is going to be very brief.
So what I played for you there was the introduction to a series of videos that Carl Rogers was recorded producing, where he then goes on to show actual therapy sessions with a client. I like this introductory piece, though, because he really basically lays out the essential components of the entire theory as it relates to doing work with clients in counseling. So let's take a closer look at this person-centered approach. Essentially, what you're looking for, since you put the person at the center, so if you think of the way this graphic is laid out, what the therapist is doing is creating a growth-promoting environment where the person is accepted, where they are prized, where they are valued, and where the assumption is that their emotions, that their own ability to understand themselves is actually valued. Now remember that in the psychoanalytic approach, it was assumed that people because they are functioning through ego defense, don't really know why they do what they do, at least part of the time. The person-centered approach makes no such assumption. Instead, the assumption is that something is interfering with their growth. The purpose of therapy is to restore the possibility of that growth. Growth happens in an environment that Rogers calls congruence, where which can only be kind of manifested in a situation where the person is able to be real and where the person is able to be authentic. So, and we'll learn more about this as we walk our way through the theory. Authenticity and realness comes from people being able to be who they really are and being valued for being who they really are. So when there's congruence between a person's real self, their authentic self, and the self that they present to the world, then people are healthy. If there's incongruence between those things, then the person is struggling. So therapy is designed by putting the person at the center to move the person in the direction of congruence. This requires empathy. So the process of therapy involves the therapist showing empathy and allowing the person to feel what empathy feels like. That's what promotes understanding in the therapeutic context. It also requires unconditional positive regard, which you can define in a lot of different ways, but essentially it's non-judgmental respect. So, regardless of what you produce, things you say, things you do, things you feel, you will still be valued as a whole entity. I may have differences of opinion with you, but my unconditional positive regard remains. So in therapy, that's what is promoted in that person-centered approach. Now, what we'll see later is that, if you ask the question developmentally, what do human beings need in order to grow in a healthy way? They need all these same things. So therapy is seen as echoing the same kinds of values that healthy developmental environments would also possess. The fundamental assumption of the theory is it starts with the idea that human beings are capable of self-determination. And again, this goes against that basic set of assumptions from Skinner's behaviorism and other radical behavioral theories, where self-determination is essentially a delusional thought. And psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis in particular, wouldn't go too far beyond that itself, where it's really your instincts, your impulses that have the most power instead of your own mind, your own ego, which is continually playing catch-up. So Rogers is saying, no, people define themselves. And how do they do that? They do it by watching themselves, by evaluating their own experiences, as well as by observing others and observing the world. So Bandura had less differences with people, or Rogers had fewer differences with people like Bandura than he did with, say, Skinner or Freud, although, not buying the entirety of Bandura's theory. They were certainly in agreement on the idea of self-determination and self-efficacy and things like that. So Rogers' basic premise, essentially, is that the person who knows best what is going on inside of you is you. And he took that into the world of psychotherapy as well. And, this really goes directly against the psychoanalytic notion that you need an analyst to decode what's going on inside of you, because you can't possibly know. For Rogers, the therapist can't possibly know what you're feeling and what you're experiencing unless you tell the therapist what that is. So you are the expert on your own heart and your own mind and your own spirit, if you bring spirituality into it as well. So people, as it says in your text, people's realities are private affairs. So the therapist has to actually get to know the client and get to know them in a context that is non-judgmental and authentic, so that the person feels safe and valued in that context. He argued that there's something called a field of experience, which is, it's kind of an umbrella term for the unique point of view of the individual. Every person has their own set of experiences, their own set of beliefs, their own set of previous experiences, their own set of predicted future experiences, and they have the current moment, and it's purely from their own point of view. So in this respect, he would agree with Kelly, who suggested that, everybody has their own way of perceiving the world based on their previous experiences and their predictions of the future. I don't believe that Rogers would disagree with that. So this field contains, as indicated by this quote, everything that's going on within the envelope of the organism at any given moment in time. So essentially what Rogers is talking about here is, if you sit quietly for a moment, right now, and pay attention to all of the sounds, the smells, the sights, if you look around your environment and become aware of what's here, what's present, and then allow your thoughts to drift back to what are the things going on in your world right now, in your life, what are the things weighing on you, what are the things that are sources of enjoyment, sources of stress. All of that is in your field of experience at the present time. It can include things from the distant past, but also the immediate present, and in whatever future projections you might be capable of imagining. So that field of experience, which is unique to you, contains all of those possibilities. By necessity, the field of experience is self-defined, and what that means, as your authors put it, the field of experience is selective. That means what you are essentially noticing and remembering things that are the most relevant to you at the present moment. In some cases, you're choosing what to pay attention to. In other cases, it's what's most available in memory. Sometimes it's things that are primed by what's going on in the world right now. For instance, when we talk about people being triggered by current events, like a news story or something like that, what we're talking about is the possibility for our experiences to be selectively brought into awareness. Sometimes we do it intentionally, sometimes the environment causes that to occur. The second word there is subjective. That means that everybody's field of experience is going to be unique, but it's also going to be incomplete. And what incompleteness refers to in this context is that since it's your field of experience, think of your field of experiences as in the shape of a bubble, and there may be things in the world or things experienced by others that are outside of your field of experience. So you would need to be exposed to things that are outside of your field of experience in order to get a better understanding of it. He also used this concept called the phenomenal field. So you've got experience, you've also got phenomenal field, where you have, and I found this image on Google Images. I'm a very visual thinker, so I find that it helps me a little bit. So you have, remember when we talked about Bandura and how he looked at the interaction between the individual and the environment. Rogers, too, looked at the interactive nature of the individual and the environment. So inside the phenomenal field, you have the self that, becomes the center of personality, and there are people that you experience, there are objects that you experience, there are actions that you take, that others take, there are things that you see, there are thoughts that you have, And you could add other thought bubbles here, things that you hear, things that you smell, anything that comes in through your senses. All of that is in your phenomenal field, so phenomena that you experience. Those things are impacted by motivation. So what are you trying to do? What are you planning to do? What do you want to do? But they're also impacted by the environment as well. So the environment in which learning takes place, those who are attempting to teach you things, to train you to do things, all of those things will impact your phenomenal field and have shaping effects on what you experience as relevant to the self. So how did Rogers define the self? As this quote suggests, Rogers thought about the self in terms of a paradox, that when people are capable of accepting themselves just as they are, then they become freer to develop more fully. So he saw that as a paradox, that often people struggle and experience things like depression and anxiety when they are in a position where they are not accepting themselves in their authentic form, when they're trying to be someone who they are not. So here, Rogers is going to start sounding an awful lot like Karen Horney, especially when we start to talk about the difference between the real self and an idealized image. Rogers defined the self in ways that will not sound all that new to you. He defines the self in a way that a lot of people, if you just ask them, what does the word self mean, they will often define it in ways that are similar to this. He defines self as organized, meaning there's a structure to it, and it's a consistent sort of overarching, holistic model of who we see ourselves as. At the same time, it is not static. It's constantly subject to growth and change. And it does interact. It interacts with the world. It interacts with expectations that are both self-generated and generated from the outside. So for Rogers, the self is actually a process as opposed to a structure that once it's developed, it is unchanging. He saw self as an evolving process that can proceed in a healthy process of growth, or it can be interfered with and become inauthentic, depending on the circumstances. He assumed that people are capable of personal development and positive change, but not just that. He doesn't stop there. He argues that people have an inborn tendency to move in the direction of positive growth. Negative experiences or psychopathology happens when that natural drive toward growth and expansion and greater complexity and greater expression of health, when that is interfered with by the outside world, primarily by judgment and control, that interferes with that natural process of growth. Now notice how different that is in comparison to, say, Freudian theory or behavioral theory. For Carl Rogers, you have inborn potential, and if the environment is right, if the environment is positive, you will move steadily in the direction of that positive expression of who you're supposed to be. If, however, the circumstances are not healthy, that growth will be stalled. But eventually, that growth can be restarted if the environment is improved. Self or self-concept, therefore, it involves a process of self-understanding. So people, when they are growing, when they are healthy, they are moving in the direction of integrating past experiences, their present life, and their expectations of the future in a way that is growth promoting. So healthy self-development or healthy self-concept development depends on this sort of holistic back and forth between the past, the present, and the future. So to review here, what does this mean when we talk about the self as a process? The self as a process means that when openness is increased, and openness to what? You're opening yourself to the possibility of what it is that is inherent in who you are. So remember, Rogers believed you're born with inherent potentials to move in the direction of health and greater complexity. When we open ourselves to that possibility, what we end up with is greater self-awareness, greater awareness of who and what we are. That leads to greater self-acceptance, which itself makes us more likely to share who we are, express ourselves, and that reduces our level of defensiveness. When defensiveness is reduced, it increases openness, and the cycle starts again. What Rogers tried to do as a therapist, and essentially the basics of person-centered or client-centered therapy, involves creating an environment that makes increased openness possible. That increased openness leads to greater self-awareness, increased self-acceptance, increased expression, and reduced defensiveness, all of which he believed increased the possibility for people to express themselves in a healthy way, which then moves people in the direction of more healthy growth. Now, the ideal self, and again, you're going to hear echoes back to the earlier in the semester when you were studying Karen Horney. Rogers used the idea of the ideal self, and I think he was heavily influenced by Karen Horney, though he doesn't, refer to it very much. But he had this idea, like Horney did, that the self-concept can be redefined in a way that is potentially problematic, but at the same time has the potential to be highly motivating. So the ideal self can take the form of a self-concept that the person wants to possess. Now that can either be a healthy thing or it can be a very, very unhealthy thing, depending on the person's current condition. The ideal self can be a model that people are attempting to move toward. It is a shifting thing. You might have one vision of your ideal self at one point in your lifetime, but that may change at a later point in time. The ideal self is different. Again, this is going to sound in many ways like Karen Horney. The ideal self is different from the actual self. The actual self may be sitting in a position that is not quite satisfied, not quite comfortable. And that discomfort may come from the degree to which this ideal self and the actual self are discrepant from one another. Rogers believed that we are at our happiest when who we really are, our actual self, and who we want to be are pretty close together. That they're not diametrically opposite. That we see ourselves as actually living a life that is very much on track with what we want ourselves to be. We become dissatisfied, we become uncomfortable, we become neurotic when our actual self and our ideal self are very, very different. When we see ourselves accurately and are comfortable with what we see, meaning that, we see ourselves pretty clearly, and the difference between what we see now and what we want out of ourselves isn't that far apart. That's a hallmark of mental health. In contrast, when that ideal self is very far removed from how we actually see ourselves, then we see ourselves as failing. We see ourselves as less valuable, as less worthy. Now, sometimes, as would be the case in Karen Horney's theory, that ideal self is being really pressured from the outside, meaning messages that the person is getting from the outside world are saying, you should be this, you should be this, you should be this. Rogers agreed that sometimes this idealized image of self can be heavily influenced by the arguments made, the expectations imposed by others. It can also come from the inside. If people believe that they really believe, wherever the information came from, that they need to be a certain way, but they can't get there, or they see themselves as inconsistent with that, it causes discomfort and it interferes with growth and development. And that concludes part 1 of Carl Rogers' person-centered theory.